Before the lawsuits, the headlines, or the devastating accusations, Shia LaBeouf was Hollywood's wild child turned misunderstood genius. Born in 1986 to a family that teetered on the edge of dysfunction, Shia's childhood was marked by turbulence. His father, a Vietnam vet battling addiction. His mother, an artist struggling to make ends meet. Raised in poverty, Shia found refuge in performance. By age 10, he was doing stand-up comedy in dingy Los Angeles clubs. He wasn't just funny. He was electric, raw, unfiltered. It wasn't long before Disney took notice. Even Stevens launched him into the spotlight, a teen sitcom hit that made him a household name. He was loud, quirky, relatable. The awkward kid next door who always had a sarcastic comeback. He won a daytime Emmy. He won the hearts of millions. But even then, there was a darkness in his eyes, something fragile underneath the surface. As the cameras rolled, Shia's demons waited quietly backstage. His transition to serious acting was seamless. He had that rare gift, the ability to be vulnerable and dangerous at the same time. He starred in Hold, Disturbia, and most notably, Transformers. The franchise made him a global star. Studios loved him. Audiences saw a little of themselves in him. He wasn't perfect, and that was the point. But behind the scenes, the lines between character and person were blurring. Fame became fuel, and self-destruction became routine. Drunken altercations, arrests, violent outbursts, Shia's tabloid legacy began to rival his filmography. And yet, even through the chaos, the industry held its breath, because there was genius in him, in Fury, Honey Boy, American Honey. He disappeared into roles with a rawness few actors could summon. He wrote Honey Boy as a semi-autobiographical story, casting himself as his own abusive father. Critics called it brave, vulnerable, healing. It seemed, for a brief moment, that Shia was turning his pain into purpose, that the boy who had been damaged by the industry was learning to take control of his own narrative. But control, as it turned out, was only an illusion. In 2018, Shia met British musician and performance artist FKA Twigs on the set of Honey Boy. Their relationship began with intensity, a whirlwind of creativity, passion, admiration. They were both artists, both raw and complex. But as the weeks turned into months, the romance turned into something darker, much darker. In December 2020, the illusion shattered. FKA Twigs, real name Talia Barnett, filed a lawsuit against Shia, accusing him of emotional, physical, and psychological abuse. It was the kind of story the world wasn't prepared for, not just because it was horrifying, but because it was so intimate. This wasn't just about headlines. This was about trust, control, power, pain. She described a man who isolated her from friends, a man who surveilled her, manipulated her, threatened her. She said he once slammed her against a car, forced her to sleep naked, monitored her every move. She said she feared for her life, and suddenly, the myth of the tortured genius collapsed. Shia LaBeouf, the boy who once made us laugh on Saturday morning, the man who told his story so bravely in Honey Boy, was no longer just broken. He was accused of breaking others, and the world could no longer look away. When FKA Twigs first entered Shia LaBeouf's orbit, it felt like an alignment of artistry and intensity. Two creatives, one a groundbreaking musician, the other a fiercely emotional actor, drawn together by shared trauma and mutual admiration. She described their early connection as euphoric. He was attentive, poetic, relentless in his affection. He told her she was the most important person in his life. He showered her with words of devotion, sent her flowers daily, kept her close, too close. In retrospect, she would call this period love bombing, a tactic often used by abusers to rapidly build dependency and emotional control. But at the time, it felt like magic. It felt like being seen. The shift came gradually, almost imperceptibly. The compliments began to carry undertones of possession. The affection turned into suspicion. She couldn't speak to male waiters without him accusing her of disrespect. Her phone use became a source of constant tension. He insisted she sleep naked, claimed it was the only way to build trust. He demanded constant proof of loyalty, of love, of subservience masked as connection. If she resisted, he sulked. If she questioned him, he exploded. And every time she tried to regain control of her own space, he reminded her, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, that she belonged to him. Twigs recounted one terrifying night when they were driving back from the desert. Shia was erratic, angry, driving recklessly. He allegedly threatened to crash the car if she didn't profess her love for him. She begged to be let out, pleaded for safety. He refused. It was a chilling moment of power play, a declaration that her safety, her agency, even her life, was subject to his emotional state. She said she felt like a hostage, not in the trunk of a car, but in plain view, behind the glass of celebrity and silence. Over time, the violence escalated, not just physical, though she claimed he did push, shove, and intimidate, but emotional. He isolated her from friends and family. He kept a loaded firearm by the bed, despite her fears. He accused her of causing his own distress, of making him angry, of breaking him when all she had done was say no. She said she woke up once to him choking her. Another time, he allegedly gave her a sexually transmitted infection without disclosure. These were not outbursts. They were patterned. And like many survivors, Twigs struggled to leave because abuse doesn't just hurt. It confuses. It wraps itself in apologies and promises, in gaslighting and guilt. Shia would cry, say he was broken, beg for forgiveness. He told her he needed her, that without her, he would fall apart, and she believed him, because she wanted to believe in love, because she had seen glimpses of the boy who made her laugh, the artist who understood her. But each time she gave him another chance. The control tightened, the mask slipped, the danger deepened. FKA Twigs wasn't the only one. Carolyn Foe, another ex-girlfriend, came forward with her own allegations, stories of physical violence, of degradation, of control, and suddenly, a pattern emerged. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't one bad relationship. This was something systemic, something practiced, and it shattered the public's illusion of Shia as the misunderstood genius battling his demon. He wasn't just fighting himself. He was hurting others in the process. When Twigs filed her lawsuit in December 2020, she wasn't just seeking justice, she was seeking acknowledgement. She was forcing the world to see what had been hidden behind Shia's performance. A vulnerability. What I went through with Shia was the worst thing I've ever been through in the whole of my life. She told the New York Times, "I don't think people would ever think that it would happen to me, but I think that's the thing. It can happen to anyone." Her voice cracked the surface. Her story peeled back the layers, and the world began to realize that even the most gifted can become the most dangerous, especially when their pain is used as a shield instead of a reason to heal. On December 11th, 2020, the silence broke. FKA Twigs filed a lawsuit in the Los Angeles Superior Court, naming Shia LaBeouf as her abuser and detailing a harrowing relationship marked by physical violence, emotional torment, and calculated control. The suit was not just about justice. It was a statement, a refusal to be silenced by shame, a declaration that survival is not weakness, but strength. And it was a warning to an industry that had enabled and excused Shia's destructive behavior for far too long. The lawsuit was chilling in its detail. It described repeated episodes of psychological warfare, coercive control, verbal degradation, manipulation. Twigs outlined moments when Shia allegedly screamed at her for hours, isolated her from loved ones, and even forced her to watch disturbing graphic content as a means of control. He would threaten to crash a car, slam her against furniture, and demand complete submission under the guise of passion. She said he gave her an STD, lied about it, then blamed her for her own pain. This wasn't just a bad relationship. This was a cycle of abuse. And for the first time, the world was being forced to see it clearly. Carolyn Foe, a stylist and another former partner of Shia, also came forward as part of the lawsuit. She recalled being pinned down in a hotel room after a drunken argument and described feeling trapped and terrified. The accumulation of the voices painted a damning portrait, not just of individual violence, but of a system that had allowed it to fester for years. Shia had been heralded as a tortured artist, a genius fighting inner demons. But the lawsuit reframed the narrative. What if those demons weren't just tormenting him, but hurting the women around him? Twigs was not asking for money. She was asking for accountability. She wanted a trial. She wanted a judge and jury to hear her story. And most importantly, she wanted to help prevent others from falling into the same trap. The whole time I was with him, I could have bought myself a business flight back to my house, she said in an interview. But it's not about that. It's about what happens mentally when somebody abuses you. It's about believing they'll change. The industry's response was swift but cautious. Some praised Twigs for her bravery. Others said little. Hollywood has a long history of tolerating men like Shia, troubled, brilliant, and violent. The tortured artist myth had long provided cover for abusive behavior. But the Me Too era had changed things. Survivors were being heard, and silence was no longer an option. Agencies began to distance themselves. Studios hesitated for the first time. Shia's future in Hollywood was uncertain. Not because of his past outbursts, but because of the women who refused to be silent. What set this case apart was not just the violence, but the psychological depth. Twigs spoke about trauma bonding, gaslighting, emotional confusion. She explained how love was weaponized, how abuse became routine. She described how leaving wasn't just a physical act. It was an emotional war. These weren't just bruises. These were invisible wounds, the kind that echo long after the door slams shut. And in telling her truth, she gave other survivors language for their pain. In the wake of the lawsuit, the public was divided. Some couldn't reconcile the actor who gave such raw, vulnerable performances with the man accused of being a monster behind closed doors. Others were quick to dismiss Twigs, suggesting she was doing it for attention. But her pain was real. Her story didn't need validation. And the more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't about revenge. It was about release, a chance to breathe again, a chance to live without fear. Shia, for his part, responded with an open letter, not of denial, but of conflicted acknowledgement. "I'm not in any position to tell anyone how my behavior made them feel," he said. "I have no excuses for my alcoholism or aggression, only rationalization. It was a strange mixture of responsibility and deflection. He admitted to hurting people. He admitted to being ashamed, but he stopped short of naming Twigs, stopped short of naming the abuse. And in that omission, he left a void, because accountability isn't just about confession. It's about naming the harm, facing the victims, changing the behavior, and, for all his poetic sorrow, Shia LaBeouf still hadn't done that when the lawsuit hit the press. The media didn't just cover it, they consumed it. Headlines across the world blared the accusation. FKA Twigs sues Shia LaBeouf for abuse. News outlets dissected every word of the court filing, every phrase in her interview, and every ambiguous line from Shia's initial statement. Overnight, he went from troubled artist to accused abuser. This wasn't another public scandal to be brushed aside. This was systemic. This was serious. And this time, people were listening. FKA Twigs didn't just spark a conversation, she ignited a reckoning. Major platforms began reevaluating their stance on supporting abusers, especially those hiding behind artistic brilliance. Shia, who had once been cast in Oscar buzz projects, was suddenly persona non grata. Netflix removed him from promotional materials for Pieces of a Woman, a film in which he had given another, acclaimed performance. His name vanished from awards campaigns. He wasn't being edited out because of poor performance. He was being erased because the public's patience had run out. The film industry has long had a reputation for shielding dangerous men. From Harvey Weinstein to Roman Polanski, stories of abuse had been swept under red carpets for decades. But the era was different now. The Me Too movement had changed the rules. Women were being believed. Survivors were telling their stories with the full weight of legal backing and community support. There was no longer room for silence or complicity. To protect Shia now would be a betrayal, not just of FKA Twigs, but of every survivor watching. Agencies and collaborators began distancing themselves. Scripts that once had his name attached were rewritten. Studios that once fought for his availability were now ghosting him. Even among fans, a shift occurred. The Shia apologists, the ones who once viewed him as a tortured soul in need of healing, began to fracture. Some still clung to the idea that this was all part of his pain, but more and more began to see the truth. Pain does not justify abuse. Trauma does not give you license to traumatize others. In the middle of this chaos, Twigs continued to speak. Not for spectacle, but for survivors. She gave interviews that were raw and composed, powerful and steady. She explained how difficult it had been to file the lawsuit, how her intention wasn't to destroy Shia's career, but to expose a cycle. She made it clear that her story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And that clarity, that emotional intelligence, only underscored her bravery. But with every story told, there came backlash. Online trolls flooded her social media with hate. They questioned her motives, accused her of lying, demanded she prove her trauma. It was a reminder of how deeply rooted victim blaming still is in society. But Twigs stood firm. She responded with dignity. She advocated for others. She used her pain not as a weapon, but as a torch, lighting a path forward. Meanwhile, Shia remained largely in the shadows. His statement, though laced with admission, lacked any sense of urgency or reparation. He spoke of sobriety, of entering therapy, of being in recovery, but he did not speak directly to the woman he had hurt. There were no public apologies, no gestures of amends, just silence, punctuated by vague references to growth. But growth means nothing if it's done in secret. Accountability is not a private journey. It's public, it's painful, it's earned. And Shia, for all his claimed introspection, had yet to take that step. The man who once bared his soul on screen now hid behind crafted statements and legal maneuvering. And the world had no choice but to move on without him. The firestorm didn't just scorch his reputation, it leveled his career. Directors stopped calling. Fashion brands turned their backs. Award shows moved on. For someone who once claimed to be Hollywood's most honest voice, the silence was deafening. Because truth, when spoken only for sympathy, is not truth, it's performance. And the industry was done applauding. In the weeks that followed the public eruption of allegations, the world waited for Shia LaBeouf to say something meaningful, to address the pain he caused, to offer contrition, to step out from behind his veil of artistic complexity and simply be human. But what came instead was a carefully constructed statement, one that danced around accountability without ever touching it directly. "I have no excuses for my alcoholism or aggression," he wrote. "I have been abusive to myself and everyone around me for years. I have a history of hurting the people closest to me." It was confession with no target, an apology with no name, a performance cloaked in self-awareness, but lacking the courage to look the victims in the eye. What Shia offered was not an admission of guilt. It was a bid for sympathy, a plea, wrapped in language that sounded mature but fell flat in the face of the deeply personal and specific harms laid out by FKA Twigs and others. His words positioned him as a man haunted by demons, caught in the spirals of addiction and trauma. But trauma, as survivors often explain, is not a hall pass for abuse. Pain is not a weapon. It is not an excuse. And what Twigs needed, what so many victims needed, was not an abstract declaration of shame. It was a clear acknowledgement of what he had done, and it never came. As his legal team prepared for court, the media frenzy cooled, but the emotional fallout remained. Twigs continued to speak in measured, powerful terms. She described the mental toll, the anxiety, the nights she woke in terror. She reminded the world that abuse is not always visible, that the bruises of the mind are as lasting, if not more so, than those of the body. And in every interview, she made one thing clear. This wasn't about canceling a man. It was about naming the violence, about protecting the next woman from what she had endured. Shia, meanwhile, stepped back from public life. He checked into a treatment facility. He paused his career. But these moves, while perhaps sincere, felt incomplete. They were done in private, without public acknowledgement, without meaningful engagement with the harm he had inflicted. Therapy and rehabilitation are vital steps, but they are not accountability. They are not justice. And they are not enough when someone has caused such profound emotional and physical harm. Worse still, some of his defenders, those who saw themselves in his pain, who worshipped the myth of the damaged genius, began reframing the narrative. They argued that Shia was being punished for being vulnerable, that his art had always been a cry for help, that he deserved grace. But the truth is, survivors like Twigs showed more grace in telling their stories than Shia did in receiving them. She could have remained silent, could have let him spiral and disappear, but instead, she chose the harder path, truth, and in doing so, she gave other victims a voice. Shia's career remains in limbo. Hollywood, quick to forgive when it's convenient, has yet to rally behind him again. And perhaps they shouldn't. Not yet, because redemption, if it's to mean anything at all, must begin with reckoning, and reckoning isn't passive. It's not a retreat into silence. It's a march through the pain toward real transformation. So far, Shia LaBeouf has not walked that path. He has lingered at the edge, half-turned, half-apologizing, hoping perhaps that time will do the work he is unwilling to do. But time alone cannot heal what was broken in those rooms, on those nights, behind those closed doors. That healing belonged to the victims, to Twigs, to Carolyn Foe, to anyone who saw in Shia's story a reflection of their own, and were reminded just how hard it is to be believed. And so the world waits, not for a performance, not for another film or interview or album or red carpet moment, but for real accountability, the kind that does not seek applause, the kind that does not hide behind addiction or trauma, the kind that simply says, I did this, and I will do everything in my power to make sure I never do it again. Until then, the apology remains unfinished for most of his life. Shia LaBeouf had been both celebrated and pitied. The gifted child actor with a volatile home life, the breakout star turned Hollywood misfit, the tortured artist who bled truth on screen and chaos off it for years. His story was told as a redemption arc in progress, a boy damaged by the industry, struggling to love, to live, to heal. But in 2020, that narrative shattered. The lawsuit filed by FKA Twigs didn't just allege harm. It reframed the myth entirely. Shia was no longer the victim. He was the abuser. And the question was no longer whether he would recover, but whether he would ever take true responsibility for the harm he caused. FKA Twigs gave the world something rare. Clarity. She detailed a form of abuse that is often invisible: coercive control, emotional manipulation, psychological violence. She gave words to wounds that many carry but cannot explain. Her courage opened doors not only for herself, but for other survivors trapped in the silence between trauma and truth. She made it clear that survival is not about escape. It's about reclaiming your story, and in telling hers, she reclaimed so much more than power. She redefined what justice can look like in a world that still struggles to believe women when the abuser is powerful, talented, or beloved. Shia, by contrast, chose distance. There was no direct apology, no act of service, no visible effort to understand the ripple effects of his violence. Instead, there were letters written in passive voice, therapy done quietly, and statements crafted to sound reflective but lacking remorse. He retreated from the spotlight, but not into accountability, into silence. And in doing so, he left behind a trail of unfinished conversations and unanswered pain. His legacy, once shaped by iconic performances and public vulnerability, now hangs in the balance. Can we still watch Honey Boy knowing what we know now? Can we hear his voice in American Honey without remembering the silence he offered his victims? These are questions we are left to ask. Because legacy is not just what you create, it's what you leave behind in people's hearts. Shia LaBeouf once asked to be seen as more than a troubled child star. He wanted to be known for his art, his bravery, his depth. But bravery is not bearing your soul on screen. It's facing the people you've hurt and telling the truth with nothing left to gain. And until he does, the only story that matters isn't the one he wrote in a script. It's the one FKA Twigs had the courage to speak aloud.